The history of the world is often written in the ink of inevitability, but in the year 1765 the birth of the United States was anything but certain. It began not with a cry for liberty but with a quiet, simmering confusion. Imagine a landscape of 3 million people, scattered across a rugged, untamed coastline, who believed themselves to be the most fortunate subjects of the most powerful empire on earth. They were British. They spoke the language of London, they dressed in the fashions of the Thames, and they toasted the health of King George III with a fervor that matched any resident of Middlesex. Yet beneath this veneer of colonial pride, a tectonic shift was occurring. How does a child decide the parent is no longer fit to rule? How does a tax on a piece of parchment evolve into a bayonet charge through the morning mist? This is the story of an empire that forgot how to listen, and a people who discovered they no longer needed to obey. It is the story of how 13 disparate, bickering colonies forged a singular identity in the furnace of global war, transforming a tax dispute into a revolution and a revolution into a republic that would alter the course of human history forever. To understand the explosion, one must first understand the powder keg. In the mid-18th century, British America was a collection of 13 separate worlds, each more different from the other than they were from England. To emergent in the cobbled streets of Boston, the life of a rice planter in the sweltering heat of South Carolina was as alien as the moon. These colonies were silos of identity: Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Cavaliers in Virginia, bound together by nothing but their shared geography and their common allegiance to the British crown. They didn't see themselves as Americans. That word was a geographical descriptor, not a political one. If you asked a man in Philadelphia what his country was, he would tell you Pennsylvania or the British Empire. The idea of a unified American nation was not just radical, it was considered a mathematical impossibility. The first cracks in this isolation appeared during the Albany Congress of 1754, a moment history remembers as the test. Faced with the looming threat of French expansion and indigenous conflict, a few visionary minds, led by the pragmatic and inventive Benjamin Franklin, proposed a plan of union. It was a simple suggestion that the colonies should act as one body for their collective defense. The response was a resounding, icy silence. The colonies were too jealous of their own power, too suspicious of their neighbors, and too comfortable in their separate identities to even consider the notion of a central authority. The Albany Plan died in a cradle of apathy, proving that while the colonies were British, they were certainly not united. Yet, for all their bickering, the colonists enjoyed what many historians call the best life in the world. They were taller, healthier, and wealthier than their counterparts in Europe. Land was plentiful. The soil was rich, and the hand of the British government was remarkably light. For over a century, the policy of salutary neglect meant that London left the colonies to govern themselves. They had their own legislatures, their own taxes, and their own courts. They were the pampered children of an empire that was too busy fighting wars in Europe to bother with the minutiae of colonial life. It was a golden age of autonomy, a period where the seeds of self-governance were planted in the fertile soil of neglect. But the sun was setting on this era of peace. A great storm was gathering across the Atlantic, born from a victory so total that it threatened to bankrupt the very empire it had saved. The 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, ended in 1763 with a British triumph that reshaped the map of the globe. France was expelled from North America, and Britain stood as the undisputed master of the continent. But victory carried a staggering price tag. The British national debt had doubled, and the London Parliament, looking at the vast expense of defending the American frontier, came to a fateful conclusion: the colonies must pay their fair share. To the ministers in London, this was a matter of simple accounting. To the colonists who had bled and died alongside British regulars to win that land, it felt like a betrayal. The era of neglect was over. The era of intervention had begun. The king's ministers reached for a tool that would spark a fire they could never extinguish: the Stamp Act of 1765. The year 1763 was supposed to be a season of celebration, a moment when the British flag flew over a continent purged of French influence. But the peace of 1763 brought with it the proclamation line, a digital-like boundary drawn across the Appalachian Mountains that forbade the colonists from settling the very lands they had just fought to win. To the frontiersmen and the land speculators, this was the first bitter taste of a new restrictive reality. London saw a need to manage a fragile peace with indigenous tribes. The Americans saw a cage. This tension set the stage for the Stamp Act of 1765, a piece of legislation that changed the nature of the colonial relationship forever. Unlike previous trade duties, the Stamp Act was an internal tax, a direct reach into the pockets of every lawyer, merchant, and printer in the colonies. Every newspaper, every legal document, even every deck of playing cards now required a government stamp. It was a tactical blunder of historic proportions. By taxing paper, the British Parliament had inadvertently united the two most vocal groups in America, the lawyers and the journalists. The outcry was instantaneous and visceral. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It became a constitutional battle cry. In the taverns of Boston and the halls of the Virginia House of Burgesses, men like Patrick Henry began to speak of natural rights and the ancient liberties of Englishmen. The resistance took a physical form in the Sons of Liberty, a secret organization that utilized intimidation and public protest to ensure the stamps were never sold. They burned effigies, they ransacked the homes of tax collectors, and they forced the British government into a humiliating retreat. Parliament repealed the act in 1766, but the damage was done. The colonies had learned a dangerous lesson, that united defiance could bend the will of the most powerful empire on earth. But London was not finished. If the Stamp Act was a clumsy hammer, the Townshend Acts of 1767 were a cold, calculating chisel. Parliament placed new duties on essential imports, glass, lead, paint, and tea. To enforce these unpopular measures, British troops were dispatched to Boston, a city that had become the beating heart of colonial radicalism. By 1770, the atmosphere in Boston was a tinderbox. Red-coated lobsterbacks and local laborers lived in a state of constant friction, a simmering resentment that finally boiled over on the icy night of March 5th. What we now call the Boston Massacre began as a minor street brawl, a crowd of angry locals throwing snowballs and insult at a lone British sentry. But as reinforcements arrived and the tension spiked, a shot rang out, followed by a ragged volley. 5 colonists lay dead in the slush, while the British soldiers were later defended in court by the future patriot John Adams, proving the American commitment to the rule of law. The propaganda machine of the Revolution had already won. Paul Revere's sensationalized engravings portrayed the event as a cold-blooded slaughter of innocents. The blood on the cobblestones of King Street became a permanent stain on the British administration, a point of no return for the psychological loyalty of the Massachusetts people. A brief, deceptive calm followed the massacre, but the underlying issue remained unresolved. The British government, desperate to save the failing East India Company, passed the Tea Act in 1773. This wasn't actually a tax increase. In fact, it made tea cheaper, but it granted the company a monopoly. And more importantly, it reaffirmed Parliament's right to tax the colonies. To the Americans, this was the poison in the sugar. They saw it as a bribe to accept the principle of unrepresented taxation. On a cold December night, the Sons of Liberty, thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. It was a silent, disciplined act of massive property destruction. It was not a riot. It was a calculated provocation. The response from King George III was not a negotiation, but a sentence. The Intolerable Acts of 1774 were designed to crush Boston into submission. The harbor was closed, the colonial charter was revoked, and military rule was established. But instead of isolating Massachusetts, these acts galvanized the continent. If the king could destroy the liberties of one colony by a stroke of a pen, he could do it to all. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, leaders from across the colonies sat in the same room, not as separate worlds, but as a unified front. They weren't calling for independence yet. They were calling for their rights as British subjects. But they also made a fateful decision: to begin stockpiling arms and organizing militias. The stage was no longer being set for a debate. It was being set for a war. The spring of 1775 did not arrive with the warmth of peace, but with the cold realization that the window for diplomacy had slammed shut. In the Massachusetts countryside, the Minutemen farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers were no longer just drilling. They were waiting. The British commander in Boston, General Thomas Gage, received his orders from London: seize the rebel leaders and destroy their cache of weapons in the town of Concord. It was meant to be a surgical strike, a show of force to cow the rabble. Instead, it became the funeral of the British Empire in America. On the night of April 18th, the signal lanterns in the Old North Church flickered in the life, and Paul Revere began his legendary ride, shouting a warning that would echo through the centuries. The sun rose on April 19th over the Lexington Common to find 77 terrified militiamen facing the vanguard of the world's finest professional infantry. "Don't fire unless fired upon," their leader, Captain John Parker, commanded. "But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Then, out of the morning mist, a single shot rang out. Its origin remains a mystery of history, but its effect was absolute. It was the shot heard round the world. The British regulars, their discipline momentarily snapping, unleashed a volley that left 8 Americans dead. But the British victory at Lexington was a hollow triumph. As they marched toward Concord and then retreated back to Boston, the woods and stone walls of the Massachusetts landscape came alive with fire. Thousands of colonial militia, alerted by the midnight riders, swarmed the British column. By the time the Redcoats reached the safety of Boston, nearly 300 of their comrades were dead, wounded, or missing. The rabble had not run. They had fought, and they had won. The news of Lexington and Concord spread like a wildfire through the colonies, transforming a local rebellion into a continental uprising. Within weeks, an improvised army of observation had surrounded Boston, trapping the British garrison in a state of siege. But the most significant event was occurring in Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress convened in May. This was no longer a meeting of aggrieved subjects. It was the de facto government of a nation in waiting. The delegates faced a staggering task. They had a war on their hands, but no army, no treasury, and no executive leader. Before they could even organize, the war demanded their attention. In June, the British attempted to break the siege of Boston by seizing the high ground of Charlestown. The resulting Battle of Bunker Hill, fought mostly on Breed's Hill, was a bloodbath that shattered any remaining British illusions of an easy victory. The American defenders, low on gunpowder but high on resolve, held their fire until they could see the whites of the eyes of the advancing redcoats. 2 waves of British elite infantry were mowed down in rows. While the British eventually took the hill on the 3rd charge after the Americans ran out of ammunition, the cost was staggering. Over 1,000 British casualties, nearly half of the attacking force, lay on the slopes. A British officer grimly remarked that another such victory would ruin them. It was a psychological triumph for the Americans. They had proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the British Empire, recognizing that the local militias needed a unified command and a professional structure. The Continental Congress made its most inspired choice. On June 15, 1775, they appointed a delegate from Virginia, a tall, silent man with a reputation for integrity and military experience as commander-in-chief. George Washington did not seek the position. In fact, he told his wife he feared his reputation would fall within months. But Washington understood something. The others did not. This war would not be won by a single battle, but by the sheer endurance of an army and the legitimacy of its cause. When Washington arrived in Cambridge to take command of the Continental Army in July, he found not a military force, but a chaotic armed mob. The men were filthy, the officers were elected by their own troops, and there was no sense of discipline. Washington spent the winter of 1775 to 1776 doing the impossible, building an army from scratch while maintaining a siege with almost no heavy artillery. The turning point came from an unlikely source, a former bookseller named Henry Knox, who dragged 59 massive cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga over 300 miles of frozen mountains and rivers. In March 1776, Washington placed these guns on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. The British, realizing their fleet was now sitting ducks, were forced to evacuate. On March 17th, the British sailed away from Boston, never to return. The first year of the war ended with a stunning American victory. But the greatest challenge and the true test of their identity was just beginning. By the dawn of 1776, the colonies were caught in a strange, violent limbo. They were fighting a war against the king's troops, yet they were still technically praying for the king's health. This was the year of the Great Divide, a time when every man and woman had to look into their own soul and decide where their ultimate loyalty lay. It was a civil war as much as a revolution. On one side stood the Loyalists, or Tories, who believed that breaking from the crown was a sin against the natural order and a recipe for bloody anarchy. On the other stood the Patriots, fueled by a growing sense that their British identity had become a cage. The catalyst that finally shattered the remaining ties of affection was not a bullet, but a pamphlet. Thomas Paine's Common Sense arrived in January like a thunderclap, stripping away the mystery of monarchy with brutal, plain-spoken logic. Paine argued that it was absurd for a continent to be governed by an island, and that George III was not a father of his people, but the royal brute of Great Britain. The momentum for total separation became an unstoppable tide. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress realized that to gain foreign allies and to formalize their government, they had to declare what they already were in practice: independent. A committee was formed, but the heavy lifting fell to a young, scholarly Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, working in a hot upstairs room. Jefferson drafted a document that would become the most important secular text in human history. The Declaration of Independence was not just a list of grievances against a king. It was a manifesto for a new kind of human existence. When it declared that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, it threw a gauntlet at the feet of every throne on earth. On July 4, 1776, the delegates signed what was essentially their own death warrant. If they failed, they would hang from the gallows as traitors. Benjamin Franklin famously quipped, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The euphoria of the Declaration, however, was short-lived. Reality arrived in the form of the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever sent overseas. While the Americans were celebrating in Philadelphia, a massive British fleet appeared off the coast of New York, hundreds of ships carrying 32,000 professional soldiers and Hessian mercenaries. Washington, move for move, was outclassed. At the Battle of Long Island in August, the Continental Army was nearly annihilated. Washington's men were raw recruits, many without shoes or proper bayonets, facing the world's most disciplined killing machine. They were driven back, pinned against the East River, and only a miraculous nighttime evacuation under the cover of a dense fog saved the army from total surrender. The rest of the autumn was a grim litany of defeat. New York City fell and would remain in British hands for the rest of the war. Washington's army was chased across New Jersey, shrinking by the day as soldiers deserted or succumbed to disease. By December 1776, the revolution was on life support. The Sunshine Patriots had gone home. The army was reduced to a mere few thousand ragged souls, huddled on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, shivering in the winter wind. The British, convinced the rebellion was effectively over, went into winter quarters. Thomas Paine, now traveling with the retreating army, wrote the words that capture the desperation of the hour. "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington knew that if he did not strike a blow before the end of the year, the revolution would vanish like smoke in the wind. He needed a miracle, and since none was provided by heaven, he decided to create one himself. On the night of Christmas 1776, Washington made one of the most daring gambles in military history. In the middle of a nor'easter with the river choked by ice floes, he led 2,400 men across the Delaware. The conditions were so brutal that 2 soldiers froze to death during the march. Their target was the Hessian garrison at Trenton. At dawn, the Americans caught the professional soldiers completely by surprise. In a sharp 20-minute battle, Washington captured nearly 1,000 Hessians without losing a single man in combat. This was followed days later by another victory at Princeton. In the span of a week, Washington had snatched the revolution from the jaws of certain death. He hadn't just won 2 small battles, he had won the psychological war. The American spirit was reborn. The fire of 1776 had not been extinguished, it had been tempered into steel. The miracle at Trenton had saved the cause, but the British Empire remained an apex predator, and in 1777, it launched a grand strategy designed to end the war in a single stroke. The plan was elegant on paper, a three-pronged assault to seize the Hudson River Valley, cutting the colonies in two, and isolating the radical heart of New England from the rest of the continent. General John Burgoyne, a man of high fashion and higher ambition known as Gentleman Johnny, began a slow, lumbering march south from Canada, with a massive train of artillery and supplies. But the American wilderness was not the manicured battlefields of Europe. The dense forests of upstate New York became a green trap. American forces felled trees to block the paths and picked off British officers from the shadows. By the time Burgoyne reached Saratoga, he was exhausted, undersupplied, and surrounded by a swarming hornet's nest of American militia and Continental regulars. In October 1777, after 2 weeks of desperate fighting, an entire British army was forced to lay down its arms. It was a global earthquake. The victory at Saratoga accomplished what no diplomat could. It convinced King Louis XVI of France that the Americans could actually win. France, sensing an opportunity to avenge their defeat in the 7 Years' War, officially entered the conflict. This was the moment the American Revolution became a world war. Now, Britain had to worry about defending London, the Caribbean, and India. The American theater was no longer their only concern. But while the halls of Versailles celebrated, the Continental Army was entering its darkest hour. Washington led his men into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was a place of misery that tested the very limits of human endurance. There were no grand battles here, only the slow, grinding war against hunger, disease, and the elements. 2,000 men died from typhus, pneumonia, and malnutrition. Soldiers stood guard in the snow with no shoes, their feet wrapped in blood-soaked rags. Yet, in this crucible, the army did not break. It transformed. Under the tireless drilling of a Prussian volunteer, Baron von Steuben, the ragged volunteers learned the art of professional warfare. They emerged from the winter of 1778 not as a militia, but as a disciplined, European-style fighting force. The first test of this new army came in June 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth. In the blistering summer heat, the Continentals stood toe-to-toe with the British regulars in a massive conventional engagement. For the first time, the American lines did not shatter under a British bayonet charge. They held. They maneuvered. They fought the British to a standstill. While the battle was technically a draw, it proved that Valley Forge had forged a weapon that could finally match the King's finest. The war in the North had reached a stalemate. The British, frustrated by their inability to crush Washington's ghost army, turned their eyes toward a new theater, the South. The British Southern strategy was based on a gamble that the Carolinas and Georgia were teeming with secret loyalists waiting for the King's protection. At first, the gamble seemed to pay off. Savannah fell, followed by the catastrophic surrender of an entire American army at Charleston. The South became a landscape of brutal fratricidal warfare, neighbor against neighbor, patriot against Tory, in a cycle of partisan violence that felt more like a blood feud than a revolution. But the British had underestimated the resilience of the southern interior. Under the brilliant leadership of Nathanael Greene, the Americans fought a war of exhaustion. Greene famously said, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." He led the British commander, Lord Cornwallis, on a wild chase through the swamps and forests, stretching British supply lines to the breaking point. At the Battle of Cowpens, the American Daniel Morgan executed a tactical masterpiece, encircling and destroying an elite British force. By the time Cornwallis reached Virginia in 1781, his army was battered, bloodied, and desperate for a seaside port where the British Navy could resupply them. He chose a small tobacco port called Yorktown. It was his final mistake. Washington, hundreds of miles to the north, saw the opportunity he had waited 6 years for. In a feat of logistical genius, he marched his army in a large French force south with incredible speed. Simultaneously, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse won a critical naval battle at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's only escape route. The trap was sprung. For 3 weeks, American and French siege guns hammered the British defenses. On October 19, 1781, the unthinkable happened. Lord Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of 8,000 men. As the British marched out to lay down their arms, their band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." They were right. The greatest empire on earth had been humbled by its own colonies. The victory at Yorktown was a thunderclap that echoed through the halls of the British Parliament, but the war did not end with the stroke of a pen on a battlefield. For 2 agonizing years, a shadow war of nerves and diplomacy played out across the Atlantic. While Washington's army waited in the Hudson Valley ragged, unpaid, and on the brink of mutiny, American diplomats Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay were engaged in a high-stakes chess match in Paris. They were caught between a humiliated Britain and a France that wanted to keep the new nation weak and dependent. In a masterclass of diplomacy, the Americans bypassed their allies and negotiated directly with London. The resulting Treaty of Paris in 1783 was a diplomatic triumph that exceeded the wildest dreams of the Continental Congress. Britain not only recognized American independence, but ceded a vast empire of land stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. The colonies had gone into the war as 13 coastal outposts. They emerged as a continental power. With the peace signed, the world held its breath for what would happen next. History was littered with the corpses of republics that had devolved into military dictatorships. Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon. The script was always the same. The victorious general seizes the crown. Washington held all the cards. His officers, furious at a Congress that refused to pay their pensions, had already suggested he become King George I of America. But Washington understood that the revolution was not about replacing one tyrant with another. On December 23, 1783, in a crowded chamber in Annapolis, Maryland, George Washington performed the most radical act of his life. He resigned his commission. He handed his sword back to the civil authorities and walked away to his farm at Mount Vernon. When King George III heard of this, he remarked, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." By surrendering power, Washington ensured that the American experiment would be a republic of laws, not of men. However, the United States of 1783 was united in name only. The new nation was governed by the Articles of Confederation, a document born of the fear of central authority. It was a league of friendship so weak it couldn't tax, couldn't regulate trade, and couldn't even maintain an army. By 1786, the country was unraveling. States were engaging in trade wars. The currency was worthless, and in Massachusetts, a debt-ridden farmer named Daniel Shays led an armed rebellion that sent a shiver of fear through the young republic's leadership. The revolution had won the war, but it was losing the peace. It became clear that unless the 13 separate worlds became one sovereign nation, they would be swallowed by the predatory empires of Europe. In the sweltering summer of 1787, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what was billed as a meeting to revise the Articles. Instead, they staged a second revolution, a legal one. Behind locked doors and windows nailed shut for secrecy, they engaged in a grueling 4-month debate over the nature of power. They grappled with the tension between big states and small states, between the North and the South, and between the need for order and the sanctity of liberty. The result was the United States Constitution, a masterpiece of compromise in political architecture. It created a government of 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, each designed to check and balance the other. It was a machine that would go of itself, built on the revolutionary idea that sovereignty resided not in a king, but in we the people. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in 1789. The Constitution had been ratified, the new government was formed, and the nation turned to the only man who could possibly hold the fragile union together. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. His inauguration in New York City was not the coronation of a king, but the beginning of a presidency. The tax dispute had become a war, the war had become a nation, and the nation had become a republic. The American Revolution was not just a change in government, it was a fundamental shift in the human story. A moment when a people decided that they were the masters of their own destiny. The journey from the Stamp Act to the Constitution had been a long, bloody, and improbable one. But as the new sun rose over the United States in 1789, the world realized that the shot heard round the world was still echoing, and the experiment of liberty had only just begun.